Hello everybody and welcome to the first video in our series of videos on international relations from 1945 up until the present day. Today we are going to be looking at the Berlin Blockade, which took place between 1948 and 1949. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know what led to the Berlin Blockade. You guys should know 4 details of the Western Allies' response to the crisis that is the Berlin Blockade. And finally, you guys should be able to list 3 consequences of the Berlin Blockade. As we saw in our last video on the war and peace in Europe between 1920 and 1945, negotiations between the Allies began at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, when the big 3 of Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin met. And then there was continued negotiations in August at the Potsdam Conference, and Roosevelt had been replaced by Harry Truman as President of the United States, and there was a massive tension at these meetings. The tension led to the Americans adopting a policy of containment. Again, we looked at this before, and 2 elements of containment were the Truman policy, which was to give military aid to any countries trying to fight off communism, and the Marshall Plan, which was to give economic aid to any countries trying to fight off, trying to rebuild and to be a capitalist country. One of the big things that was decided at these meetings also was that Germany was to be divided into 4 zones: a Soviet zone, an American zone, a British zone, and a French zone. On top of this, Berlin, which is the capital city, which was located in the Soviet zone, was also to be divided into 4 zones. The Allies differed in how they wanted to treat Germany. The US and Britain wanted to revive the German economy, to keep it as a capitalist country, so it would be part of their containment policy to stop the spread of communism, to contain it within the countries it was already in. To do this, they would offer Marshall aid to Germany, whereas the USSR wanted to keep Germany weak, and they wanted them to pay huge reparations. Also, the USSR had been invaded twice by Germany during World War I and World War II with a massive loss of life, so they were not too keen on reviving Germany as a powerful state. This brings us to the start of the crisis that is known as the Berlin Blockade. The thing that really kicked it off, there had been these tensions, these differing ideologies, but the straw that broke the camel's back was on the 22nd of June 1948. The Western Allies introduced a new currency called the Deutschmark into the western parts of Germany and into the western parts of Berlin to try and revitalize the economy as part of this Marshall Aid Plan. Stalin responded to this by blocking all routes in and out of Berlin. All road, rail and canal routes were all cut off. All surface transport links were gone. And West Berlin, this particularly had a big effect on West Berlin, as now it was cut off from the rest of Germany. It was in deep Soviet territory, and now all routes into Berlin were cut off. The Allies were really faced with 3 options. They could either give in to Stalin's demands and hand over control of West Berlin to the Soviet Union, and this would have prevented the 2 million people who were in West Berlin from starving. The second option was they could invade the Soviet zone. They could try blast through the blockade, but this would risk causing another major war, which wasn't really an option at the time. The final option they had was they could fly in food and fuel and all the other supplies into West Berlin that they needed. This would be a huge operation. It would require massive amounts of organisation and it would cost an awful lot of money. They did, however, decide to fly in these supplies. They had an operation which they called Operation Vittles, and the Soviet Union had left 3 20-mile wide air corridors open, and they decided that they were going to fly in supplies through these air corridors. So what were the details of Operation Vittles? Well, for 11 months, from June 1948 until May of 1949, food and other supplies were flown into Berlin by British, French and US planes. The second detail is the inhabitants of West Berlin. They depended on these flights for absolutely everything. There was nothing coming in. By the winter of 1948, they were living on dried potatoes, powdered eggs, powdered milk. They'll occasionally get some cans of meat, 125,000 people were unemployed because there was all industry within the western part of the city shut down. Part of this was because they only got 4 hours of electricity per day, because most of the electricity lines would be going through Soviet zones, which would have been cut off. So a lot of people would have had to light their houses by candle and stuff like this. The third detail of Operation Vittles was, in those 11 months, 275,000 flights carried 1.5 million tons of supplies. At its very peak, there was one plane was landing every 3 minutes in West Berlin. When they decided to do this, Russia was then left with a choice. Would they risk shooting down these planes and causing a war? It would have been seen as an act of war. Or would they just try and hope to break the spirit of the West Berliners by conditions being so bad? So the final detail then was that the operation of the airlift, it cost over $100 million, and 79 men would have died on accidents while trying to deliver these supplies. Finally, on the 12th of May 1949, Stalin decided to lift the blockade. He did this because he realized that he couldn't break the West Berliner spirits, and decided to try adopt a new policy afterwards. So the 12th of May 1949 was the end of the Berlin Blockade. There were three major results from the Berlin Blockade. The first thing was that in May of 1949, just as the blockade was ending, the Western Allies being the United States, France and Britain, they set up a new Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany as it would have been known. In response, in October of 1949, the USSR created the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. So this was the division in Germany that was to last up until 1990, and this really is where it came from. It was an immediate consequence of the Berlin Blockade. The next consequence was the setting up of military alliances. So NATO and the Warsaw Pact were set up. So the Western Allies set up this thing called NATO, which is still going today. They set this up in 1949. It is known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this was a military alliance that offered mutual support in case of attack. In response to this, the USSR set up the Warsaw Pact 6 years later in 1955 with the countries of Eastern Europe, which would have been in the Soviet satellite states. The final result of the Berlin Blockade that we will discuss was the establishment of the Berlin Wall in 1961. One of the big issues for the Soviets was that they felt that the Western Allies propping up West Berlin and making it economically viable would cause people in East Berlin to believe that capitalism was better than socialism, or communism, and between the years of 1945 and 1961, nearly 1/6 of East German population had fled to the West. So to deal with this, the Soviet Union decided to put a wall between the eastern part of Berlin and the western part of Berlin. That happened in August of 1961. That brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know what led to the Berlin Blockade. So the tensions, the introduction of the Deutschmark, the divisions of Germany. Next, you guys should know 4 details of the Western Allies' response to the crisis. And finally, you guys should be able to list 3 consequences of the Berlin Blockade. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.